we could go ahead and start.
Yeah.
All right. Welcome everyone. Just thank you for spending some time with us, and we look forward to getting your insights and information. What we're doing today is we're looking for priority lists and comments from the community about the priority of changes that the community would like and what they perceive being the best optimal use of county resources for the most bang for the buck, as we like to say. And the last meeting, and when you have discussions about potential ordinance changes, there were several about streamlining, but there were several more related to, I would call them, quality of life amendments. And so we want the county's #1 priority, or the department's #1 priority, would be, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, would be focused on streamlining anything that would help move applicants forward, move the permitting, the licensing process forward as quick as possible. And so that's the department's focus, and we want to hear from the community of what specific pain points would be best utilized in this ordinance amendment, or best fixed in this ordinance amendment, and then also if there are quality of life requests, kind of how would they rank in the proposed changes for the streamline? If the community thinks that the quality of life is more important or would take top priority over streamline, we would have to go back to GGC and get that direction as well. So we're just here to get feedback and information from the community, and as we move this process forward. I think Mike, you've traveled all the way from the coast, so you go ahead and start us off.
Is there anybody else here who'd like to start? No? Great. I'm happy to begin. Thank you. I think the way that we kind of approached the memo, and we shared this to our membership and to you all yesterday, there's an element of prioritization in it, but it's also kind of a roadmap of a couple of different sections, categories of items we could approach. And the question becomes, really, how much resources do we have to address them? Like, one of the categories, and this is not in priority order, is items that seem like they would be really easy to fix. Things that are just language aligning with DCC, like stuff that's there should be no controversiality around that. And so when we're talking about how much resources the county has to put towards things, our hope is we can, in an ideal world, we'd love to get all of this done. But understanding that we might be able to approach different categories and say, oh yeah, well, we only have 4 categories, but within those categories, there's all these different ideas. So if we just want to even go through some of the items from the memo, I don't know if you guys had a chance to look at it. We sent it on the later side of yesterday, but the categories that we identified were application requirements, kind of that would streamline the process towards towards distribution of the licenses, process requirements that would also streamline, and then generally beneficial impact recommendations that big bang for the buck really would benefit a lot of people and come at it from a bunch of different ways, and also would benefit the county. And so really it's a question of how deep are we able to go on some of these things, because priorities versus time, and maybe the county looking at these things says, oh, we don't think all of this is too much to do because it's not really that controversial. Some things are going to be more controversial than others, but as far as going through the list, I'm happy to kind of walk through the different items if that would be beneficial. But that's the hope, that we can get as much as done possible, and looking to you guys to say, oh, here's how much time we actually have to put towards this, and saying, what we think would be a reasonable approach on the county side to how much we can get done.
Yeah, and I think that would be reasonable. And also, if I don't know if you have this data or information, if you can kind of indicate how many of your members have spoken up about specific requests or specific items, so we have a sense of, if we address this, we're going to help this many people. If if we're looking for more bang for the buck,
Sure.
kind of, yeah.
And I think that we've, I guess in terms of what order we can go through this in, maybe if we want to start on maybe the larger kind of bang for buck items and then, or maybe actually we should start with the ones that are less complicated and then roll into the ones that might be a little bit more. Does that work for you guys? How would you like to proceed?
Yeah, that's fine.
Of course, if people want to make comments from the chat and whatever, I certainly don't want to dominate the conversation. If people, you know,
Yeah, maybe we don't go item by item right now, let people talk, and then if there's time, you know, because as you're saying, you know, don't want to.
Well, I mean, just to, in terms of, I mean, one of the things that we tried to look at related to the streamlining is what are requirements here for the application or for process that you all might look at and say, well, you know, if this isn't done this way, then we might not be able to issue the license, right? And so trying to identify those types of streamlining things. So those are the first two things in the memo. The red lines to the site plan and the cultivation and operations plan. So, you know, streamlining what the requirements are for that. So when you guys see what has been submitted, it's like, oh, this is easier to put through than asking for all these different changes and all these different requirements. You know, I don't know how in depth you want to get to each one of the texts, but
Yeah, I don't think we need to, because we can review.
right. So, but in terms of those things, do those
weeds.
things seem like complicated changes, or does that seem like something that would be, you know, relatively uncomplicated, and so, you know, we can put that in the easier category? Because like some might be more complicated, right? And so when we're trying to say how much resources do we have versus how many complicated things do we have to deal with, like trying to fill the box of time with as many things as we can.
Yeah, well, each change is going to have to be reviewed with the MND in light and kind of assess, and that we're gonna have, like we said, can't get in the weeds on that and have to kind of go back and see what are the requirements within the MND. And so,
well, the good news is that on the materials that we had presented originally, that were kind of, and I can resend them.
We have
with the grid. Remember the grid that has all of exactly.
Yeah.
So we have done the work on these different items to say, you know, what is going to touch the MND, what isn't. We've also provided the rationale or draft of rationale document for the items that do, but many of these that we have on our list don't really touch that in any meaningful way as far as our analysis has determined. So that's, you know, the hope is that we can, with what we've provided, have you guys say, okay, you know, we feel like we have time to do what percentage of this, and then we can say, okay, among those that percentage, what should we really focus on? Yeah, so
I guess we kind of have a circular conversation. We're asking for priorities and you're asking for like like how much bandwidth we have. So you can set priorities. Like we're still looking for that. What is the top priority for the community? You know, and yeah, and so that's kind of, because like I mentioned, the county's priority is streamline, make it as fast as possible for processing.
Correct.
And
we've included those, so like in here, we have those items like.
No, I understand that. I understand that. So like, all I'm saying is we're looking for kind of information from the community of the major pain points of going through the application process and how can those be addressed for you guys.
Okay, Hannah, I will you unmute.
Hi, forgive me, I'm super sick, otherwise I'd be there. And I probably am gonna have to supplement comments later because of how sick I've been. But I just want to get to this issue of priority. I think that for the most part, the items in MCA memo are really easy to do and are the pain points, particularly those that relate to, as we in detail in our prior memos and in this kind of detail how other agencies already deal with a lot of the issues, and that the correct way of checking to make sure that people are adhering to the other state agencies is to let the state agencies determine that. And what's been going on the most, and particularly I've seen it a lot repeated because of how many times materials are lost through MCD, and each separate bunch of people who are reviewing applications now, kind of it's a Groundhog Day, right? They start over. So the way they read ordinances or requirements really does matter at this point because the institutional knowledge is gone. Therefore, they're asking for things that aren't the right things, which is why we're saying, hey, wait a minute. If we rephrase these things and say, this is really what you need in order to satisfy not only our ordinance, but also the MND, that's good. And then if the person provides the satisfaction that they've fulfilled the state requirements, that should be good too. And that's really where a lot of the focus was, because where a big pain point is going back and forth with reviewers that are reading particular ordinance language that is not the correct language of the standards. So for example, I have one right now where a 4-leaf planner just asked for, because let me get this right, it's completely wrong. The 4-leaf planner said, because the LSA did not mention the well as being a deep water well, the 4-leaf planner, who doesn't know water rights law, is saying we have to prove that we have a water right besides the well permit. They don't know what they're talking about. I had to spend a whole lot of time writing out a long example and giving them the history of the back and forth of what happened with respect to CDFW already reviewing information about that well in order to straighten them out. It's ridiculous. And because they don't understand what the actual other agency laws mean, they're asking for things that they don't understand how they work. So what we're trying to do is look at this ordinance and say, how do we do it without asking for things that our planners, who may be very skilled at all kinds of planning stuff, don't understand the rules in other agencies. I have a lot of other stuff to say, but like I said, I'm pretty bad right now. So I hope you'll allow me to supplement my comments in writing and some other time soon.
Of course, just, yes, feel free to email us, future comments. I believe you have all of our emails.
And I can also just, looking at this document that we provided to you all, and to our membership, I can look through it and tell you which ones are not related directly to the issuance of licenses, so like, for example, going to section 3 of beneficial impact recommendations, number 4, personal adult use cultivation. So the recent code enforcement activity in Redwood Valley has moved, my understanding, at the Redwood Valley MAC, and folks are interested and open in this idea of removing the 10-acre restriction for personal use cultivation from the ordinance, as long as people adhere to the setbacks that are there. But that's not going to get people their licenses faster. So that's a recommendation here that isn't directly tied to that streamlining process. And there are a couple of those in there also related to the combining district and the prohibition districts. These are items that have been discussed broadly that we know are kind of what we discussed were try to look at things that are going to streamline the issuance of licenses on the one hand, and then the other hand, what's going to provide the most bang for the buck or help the most number of people, etc. So those combining districts items are not related to issuance of license. They're beneficial, but that maybe it's not something that has to happen today, but we know there are global issues that county council has raised related to the prohibition zones as they're currently written into the ordinance. We know there's another one coming up. We know there are concerns globally from the board about how it's implemented. So, you know, that's something that could be addressed, but maybe it doesn't want to get addressed in this particular round. Maybe it wants a separate conversation, a separate ordinance change, etc. But basically, all of the other items in here, from up to page 9, barring the ones that I just mentioned, and the ones from page 9 forward are the aligning with DCC language that is just kind of, there should be no, that's really just like the most basic type of change. So just taking out those 4 or 5 things that I mentioned, all the rest of the items in here are kind of the priorities for streamlining the issuance process.
We also have Scott Ward, who has a question in the Zoom link. All right, Scott, I'm gonna ask you.
Yes. Good morning.
Morning. We can hear you, Scott.
Okay, I guess it's appropriate time to bring this up. I would like the ordinance to be amended for the setback to be measured from the boundary of the cultivation or the cultivation structure rather than the security fences required. A lot of times logistically, it's pretty hard to put a fence tight into the cultivation area or the structures, and it makes more sense to have an outer boundary, which may lie within the new 100-foot setback, and it's not practical. And if the purpose for the setback is to avoid the annoyance of cultivation, then I don't see why the setback has to be measured from a security fence. If security fences provide security, the setback is to provide a buffer between adjacent properties from the cultivation and its operations, and this fence is just a fence.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes, Corinne Hall. I think that if you are seeking immediate and accelerated options for streamlining, nobody that I put in less than half a minute, straggled in 3 minutes late, is to use affidavits in renewal processes, affidavits in attesting to what is existent or needs to be existent to qualify for some particular regulation. And trust that an inspection or aerial surveillance is going to verify or establish a concern. It has been a very difficult process with all the applicants who are still waiting for formal licensure, as well as those in renewal, not to have a more efficient pathway. And as Hannah had mentioned, not requiring so much duplicative interaction.
Thank you.
Michelle, did you have a comment or were you just applauding Corinne's comment?
No, I have a comment.
Okay.
That means I can speak. Is that what you're telling me?
Go ahead.
I just want to piggyback on what Hannah was saying, because I've experienced that same scenario with a bunch of other things, with somebody not understanding or reinterpreting the regulation. So I think as far as the permitting process, creating a checklist similar to what the inspector now has, that they just check the box. There's a well permit, there's a this, there's a that, there's the other thing. So that each individual new person that comes on is not reinterpreting the regulations. because that has caused quite a bit of duplicative work. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Hannah?
Hi, I just want to kind of straighten out that I think that there are three different sub-issues regarding setbacks and fencing. One is the idea that the setbacks, the increased setbacks, were always meant, even though it wasn't written in this way, the date was keyed to basically be applicable to phase 3 people. And that's what it was all about. It was a recognition that the people who had always been there, meaning they had to prove proof of prior cultivation, so therefore they were phase 1 people. And then even phase 2, because phase 2 was indoor only, and indoor could have a setback of the building, especially if they're in an industrial area. That was what phase 2 was about. So setbacks weren't really applicable in the same way. But that the date really keyed to phase 3. So that's one issue in terms of setbacks and when the 100 feet should kick in versus the 200 feet. The second is the issue that Scott brought up with respect to fencing and where the setback is counted from, I think is very, very, very important. Because if the issue is we want to make sure that the cultivation activity is far enough away from the road or the neighbor or whatever, that's important. Okay, that's fine. But many people, especially given the terrain, put a greater fencing area than right around their cultivation. In fact, I have a client right now who, because we didn't realize the little private road that goes through their ranch and another might go through 2 more, that they are now having to do a double fence to move the fence closer to where their cultivation is, just to meet the setback because of the wording of the ordinance as it's currently worded. Even though the relevant real factor, which was intended when the ordinance was written, was where the activity is, not where the fence is. So Scott's point is a really important one. Then the third point, which is tried to get in that, and I'm so sorry, this is so painful. It's painful for me and probably painful for you guys to listen to. But the third point is that some structures, hard-walled structures that are lockable, don't need separate fencing. So, for example, hard-walled greenhouses that actually have locks, not hoop houses that the plastic can be got through, or shipping containers that have locks. Other things that have hard walls and locks shouldn't require separate fencing. The point of the fencing is security. The point of setback is to make sure it's far enough away from neighbors to not be an issue. It used to be that the ordinance also went to the length of making sure that the distance from the road was far enough so that it couldn't be seen. But everybody knows that in Mendocino County, the terrain is such that depending on whether you happen to live uphill or downhill on the road, that wasn't feasible. So they changed that. So I think we need to look at fencing and security as 2 separate issues and what the purpose is. Setback and security as 2 separate. And the setback should be judged from where the cultivation activity is. The type of fencing and security that's needed should be applicable to the type of structure that it is.
Great, thank you. And for the fencing, I believe I'll also look at the state requirements and see if we can see if that
The state
makes
doesn't
sense to
have
us.
any, the state has no fencing requirements.
Yeah, well, yeah, just looking at the security requirements for the state, just seeing if we can make sure that the alignment with the county.
Right. Yeah, I don't, basically the state leaves it upon the person to secure their place and that there's, secure from unauthorized access, but it doesn't list specifically how you do that. At one time for distributor transport only, they required cameras, but then they removed that for distributor transport only. They certainly do not require cameras for cultivation. So really they understood that, particularly in rural areas, that security is kind of a different animal and that each site knows best how to secure itself. So again, there's the issue of protecting neighbors from the closeness of the cannabis cultivation, and then there's security. And pretty much most sites know that they need a certain level of security to keep them safe and keep themselves from ripoffs. Anything will happen. Anybody can be ripped off. Anybody can be subject to any kind of invasion, whether it's a home or a business, and that's a business of any kind. And so I think that we should separate out the issue of security so that other people cannot easily access the site or access the stored materials. Makes sense. Setbacks from neighbors so that they're not having to be right next to where cultivation is happening makes sense. But we should be careful about how we measure those things.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
in the memo, section 3, number 1 is the setbacks, proposed red lines that was mentioned related to the dates. Related to phase 3, we have fencing proposed red line in section 3.3. And so, those fall under beneficial impact, but they're also process related. So, I can give you the numbers if you want, where I can identify which ones are not specifically related to the processing stuff, if you want, just for notes, because the rest of them would be the priorities.
No, there's no need for that because we can review and make that assessment. Yeah. Thank you though. Any other comments online? We have several people on who haven't taken the opportunity to speak. No pressure. You don't, just.
Yes.
May I ask a question?
Sure. We may or may not have an answer.
Oh, it's an easy one.
Relative.
After today's meeting, what is the intention of moving forward with these recommendations?
Yeah, the intent, and correct me if I'm wrong, is to take these recommendations, create a summary, present it to the GGC. Right now, the direction is towards streamlining and to get direction whether or not we want, whether or not GGC committee wants us to work in these other quality of life amendments in addition to the streamlining, and then assessing resources available of which priorities the GGC would like the staff to focus on.
Do you expect this report to be going to the next GGC meeting at the end of this one?
I think it will absolutely be given the GGC update on the 25th, this Monday. But I don't know how. So they'll absolutely be getting an update. I don't know exactly what that update will look like, but we intend to try to keep this on a task.
I also sent the GDC our applications and we move up. And I think we did a pretty good job of identifying the priorities. It's like, this is not the whole ordinance. There are many parts of that chart that were not included in these items. It really is anywhere where there's an opportunity for confusion or something that might delay the issuance, trying to create clarity that would remove that delay. So I feel good about this.
Understood.
Very serious.
Hours, hours, and hours.
That's good. I think we got it.
Yeah.
Hannah?
Yeah, I wanted to clarify the issue listed on page 1 of the MCA memo, let's see, D1, actually, it had to do with the D3, which was D4, and that needs to be clarified a little bit. I think that we're all understanding that both immature plant area and canopy areas need to be depicted on the site plan. What that issue was trying to get at was that the site plan instructions or in the ordinance saying something about all disturbed areas needed to be shown. And we keep going back and forth with different planners about exactly the best way to do that. On the one hand, we really, when we show what's been done, whether it's grading or just building, that shows disturbed area, unless it's been done on an area that was previously graded or previously disturbed. But that's not really well answered by requiring show all disturbed area on the site plan, because it's really about, well, when was the disturbed area and is there any prohibition of disturbed area? No, the only prohibition of disturbed area is whether or not any immature plant area, any new immature plant area, since that provision of the ordinance was enacted, was done, caused new ground disturbance, and that's prohibited. So what this comment was trying to get at, and it's just a little inartfully worded because the original work that the tech team we did, it kind of transferred over poorly. So I take responsibility for that. But what that's trying to get at is not saying that immature plant areas shouldn't be listed on the site plan, but rather we really need to narrow what are the planners having to review, and are they the appropriate person to review a particular thing, and with how is it related to the ordinance. The ordinance prevents new immature plant areas that are separate from canopy areas to create new ground disturbance. So if it's on a place that's already had ground disturbance, no problem. So what this was trying to do is say, hey, with respect to ground disturbance, just limit it to whether or not the immature plant area is a new ground disturbance or not. I think that the issue of overall ground disturbance comes up during the CEQA review, but since the county is no longer doing that CEQA review, and we already know that if the applicant is following the ordinance, then under the MND, it will have survived the county CEQA. So really the issue of whether or not the overall disturbance is less than significant is going to be addressed during the state CEQA issue. And regardless, it's just not something that is easily overlaid. And it's really stumbled a lot of these planners where they're trying to understand why is it that they need to see all the ground disturbance. And the issue isn't really seeing all the ground disturbance, it's that interactive process that might happen under a real CEQA process where it's a matter of when did that ground disturbance happen, was it a less than significant impact or whatever, and just requiring something on a site plan doesn't, instead becomes one of those pain points that you're talking about because it's not really understood how it interacts, and it turns into something that looks like a prohibition when it's not supposed to be a prohibition, except to the extent that new immature plant areas are not allowed to be put in if it would create new ground disturbance. And so it's totally appropriate to make people identify whether whether the new immature plant area was put in requiring new ground disturbance, or if it was only on existing ground disturbance area.
Gotcha. It's just, you saying planners were having an issue, distinguishing what was required in the site map due to the inclusion of all ground disturbances? Is that what I'm getting?
I would say some planners, I'll give you a recent example. They looked at the exact wording of the instructions that were written by whomever, and they required all ground disturbance. And the only way we could do that, and then they were trying to compare the grading plan that had been issued under a permit to the site plan. Well, under the ordinance, the only places that those kind of issues would come up is if under the sensitive species and habitat review, CDFW felt that the amount of disturbance to sense was such that and it wouldn't even really just be ground disturbance, it would be other factors too, if they felt it kicked it over the less than significant impact. So a planner asking to overlay all ground disturbance is kind of not relevant. The CDFW referral would already have the grading permit, would already have the site plan that showed all of the activities, and could ask further questions about, hey, when was this done, or what was this about, or whatever. But by the planner making kind of, I would say, the busy work of having to of them on taking it upon themselves to compare the grading plan with what was on the site, that's just not even relevant to the ordinance. There's nothing other than you can't create new ground disturbance if you have a new immature plant area. Other than that, there is nothing in the ordinance that prohibits ground disturbance. It's a matter of cumulatively are all the activities to create the cultivation site a less than significant impact on sensitive species and habitat or not. And ground disturbance is only one factor, and it's not the planners who have the expertise to determine that. At that point, they've kicked it over to CDFW. So it's just kind of gets stuck in this thing where the planner is requiring a level of information that is not quite the right information. It takes a considerable amount of time to try and overlay, when in fact, dealing with resource agencies, which I do all the time, that's not how they would go about it anyway to get at the information that they need. So it's not that anybody should, nobody's trying to say, oh, we'd hide the information. No, they're already required to give a copy of the grading permit with their sensitive species and habitat review questionnaire, right? It's not, there's no hiding the ball or anything. It's just a lot of these issues, the way that they're worded, require a planner to make determinations that they're not biologists, they're planners. And so it's the biologists that need to see information that they would normally need to see, which is not necessarily where is all the ground disturbance. They could look at the activities and then ask the cultivator, wait, is this really a kind of disturbance or what? And they would see that there was a grading permit applied for, whatever. And if a grading permit was applied for, that meant that all erosion control measures and everything had to be in place. So it's just a different set of factors that the resource agencies are actually looking at than some technical was there ground disturbance, except that the ordinance does say no immature plant area if it would create new ground disturbance. So that I think is a totally legit thing to zone in on and require the information on the site plan. Is it a new ground disturbance?
Gotcha. Thank you for that clarification.
Sure.
Paul?
Yes, hi, this is Paul Hansbury. First of all, I want to say that the memo that was the redlining that was done by MCA, I totally support. I think that the level of work that went into it, the level of sophistication, rather than just people spouting, people that were boots on the ground that may not have the ability, the wherewithal to express themselves in terms that would be understand and translatable. I think that the efforts that MCA did that to put this together, to get the feedback from the boots on the ground, from the stakeholders, and put it in terms that could be understood and were relevant to the ordinance, I think that it's the level of sophistication and the level of importance of what they did. I think that's to be applauded. I fully support everything that they're doing. That being said, I think that what is being addressed here is, I've said from day one that the problem with the ordinance is that it's punitive. It goes to the lowest common denominator. And what's happening is, instead of the 10,000 people that were originally estimated to be cultivating in Mendocino County, you have a few hundred, and you're losing more and more every day. What you're doing is you're getting rid of the good people, the people that want to come up and step up and do the right thing. And there are other good people out there, but they're not incentivized to do that. You're not incentivizing. This is why the program is not self-sufficient, because you don't have enough participants, because you're not incentivizing people. Why would people want to pay a bunch of money so they could pay more taxes when they can't make the money? You need to make things a little bit easier for people, a little bit more normal. Then it's a business license. Let's treat it like a business license, like a normal business license, and not write the ordinance for the lowest common denominator, the people that are going to break the laws anyway, whether you write them that way or not. I think that, considering that, it really needs to be thought about that these are the laws are being written for people to adhere to. These are guidelines for the people. There should be a bit of flexibility because every situation is different, and there should be a method for that, and not just go by the letter of the law and have the planners justifying their existence by going by the letter of the law, and not incentivizing people to join and to become a part of the program. I mean, the program is there for people to enjoy, but if they have no other choice, if it's so difficult, they're not going to do it. So just think about what the incentivizing people and encouraging people to be a part of the program, so that the program can be self-sufficient, and perhaps you might have a more successful program. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Right.
Well, it looks like we might be done with today's meeting. And so, Michael, I think that under you've submitted your memo to the GGC, so that'll be part of the record there.
I sent it in that email, but I will submit for the actual meeting. And I mean, my hope is that even if during I guess, is there gonna be a separate agenda item? Because there's always just, so far, there's just been the MCD update. So it would maybe be good if possible to have an agenda item to talk about the ordinance revision specifically, just as like, to be able to discuss it, even if there's no materials, so that there could be some sort of direction or, conversation had on the record. And then, because the outline that had been previously shared was that, we have this meeting, ultimately it will come to the GGC will discuss, the county council will, from this meeting and talking to the GGC, develop language, which will then come back to the GGC, be discussed there, and hopefully we would be having an active engagement prior to those meetings, so we see where things are headed and we can understand what bandwidth will allow moving forward, and then ultimately coming before the board in November for adoption. So, we're happy to participate in more conversations as you go through the memo and strike out the ones. But again, my hope is that what we've included here will not be beyond the available bandwidth of the department. There might be one or two that's like, oh, this might, we might want to wait a minute, but my hope would be that the way that we categorize this with the priorities, the easy things, and then the bigger picture issues, I would hope that we might be able to address all of them. I'm an optimist.
I'll leave it up to the department of whether or not you would think it's beneficial to add a separate item to.
I think that, it's nothing that I'm opposed to at this point. I don't recall, so the agenda is already set. So I don't recall that we have a separate item. I don't think that we do. No, we do have a separate item for that as grant update. So we're expanding the scope of the meetings, and I think this one will make sense to, obviously we're going to track this.
Sure, right. Yeah, but I guess with the timeline, knowing that there won't be another GGC meeting until the end of October, if this is wanting to go through them in order to then wind up with language and with the board, just wanting to keep track of that schedule. And because I know that like the way that Councilor Curtis had identified as like, there's basically 2 of these ordinance revisions a year. And so like trying to get this one in before the end of the calendar year, especially since we are really still up against these deadlines. Like we got this reprieve from the state, but everything has to basically be done by, the end of next year, including the site-specific environmental review. So,
well, and I'm not immediately familiar with a reference to 2 updates a year, but I absolutely, there's a sense of urgency to get this done for getting quickly about.
Great.
Deanna, did you have a comment? Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I just wanted to, I don't know if the renewal every 5 years obviously is something that we support as well. And whether or not an inspection has to be done every year or not is of course the $1 million question. As a part of that, also I just do want to underscore Michael's point about not having thrown in the kitchen sink. There are a few really, really dicey issues that were always put off that we did not bring up, like generators and a few other things that really did get to the heart of some issues touching in the MND a little bit deeper than is comfortable. And so I hope that you all see that this is really an attempt to go, look, these are issues, even if they sound individually very tiny, are important, and that they add up to a collection of things that still don't address the heart of the issue, which is at some point in the future, a better ordinance needs to be made that has all of the safeguards without all of the minutia. And we have recognized that this is not the time to address those things. We need to wait until an EIR is done and see if there's enough basis to really go at some of those deeper issues. So when you're reading this and saying, well, you know, this is nibbling around the edges, yeah, because we are limited in that respect. But we do believe that each of these clarifications, each of these refinements will shift the burden to still having the same requirements that are required under the MND, but narrowly tailoring what is required of the applicant to really meet that burden, and to make sure that whatever the standard is, if it's questioned in a compliance end of things, that the right people are looking at the compliance. So if it's a resource agency issue, the resource agency is. And that is essentially what we had all talked about, and in fact was the first step of the streamlining of amendments that happened earlier, was to kind of shift the way things are done. This further supports that issue. And even if certain individual language does not seem monumental, it's again about how the reviewers read the ordinance and how much time it takes to address each of those picky issues as they're coming up. I would love to have some indication of whether we'll be hearing from county council and the department about what it, after having digested some stuff, what it is going to recommend to the GGC as the top issues to deal with, and what the timing of our having that input from you all, because I think that we all look at this as a partnership, and that we want to best support the actions going together as we bring forward changes to our government. It would be helpful to have some indication from staff and county council what it's going to recommend to be brought forward, or when we could have that inclination.
When we can have information on what.
On whatever, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, and I think that I hope with mine is that we'll have some good perspective in advance of the GGC on Monday. But you know, as far as having that in a well sort of documented, communicated plan in advance, I don't see that happening right now. We're talking about just a week away. But again, we're trying to kind of keep this on a fast track, right? And to me, I think there's could be some areas that we can actually incorporating and some that are going to warrant more discussion with the GGC.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Fran, did you have something?
Well, yes, peripherally related to streamlining. So forgive me if you think I'm off the rail, but one concept that I think is very important for the staff team to keep in mind is that the pending grants are almost a necessity for some applicants to be able to do it. And the more we can proceed with a fast track for everything, the better off people will be in compliance. So that's a concept. Another issue for the team to consider is there is a cohort of people who had been licensed for quite a while, whose renewals are pending with no change. Those should be done in heartbeat. It should be an easy renewal. And when Paul Hansbury was talking about lack of incentives in the program, that's one. That if you have complied for years, you should be an easy renewal. So that's a concept we mentioned. Number three, recently when people have queried the department for an update on their own situation, sometimes they've had responses that were, well, we just can't get to it. Given that staff has changed and that it's scarce, what should people do for an update? because it influences decisions they make in their business. So what should we do?
So I'm gonna say, first off, I think that this is beyond the scope of today's meeting, but I'd like to try to give this a moment. So what type of updates are you referencing?
Well, mostly it's people who have, I believe, been assigned to a planner, but have not had any information back and forth, or have not had recent updates from previous requests of were they complete in their submission. And I think some of this has to do with the changeover from old systems to Acela and things that were not transferred. But I'm not quite sure. I know that often we are respectful of the needs of the department, but also, as I say, decisions need to be made for the businesses and what they're planning, and if they're bringing in a crop this year, what they're going to do with it. So it's just another desire that cultivators have for a transparency in why things are happening the way they are. And I am incredibly empathetic to all the changes that you all have endured. But the faster we can complete some of the removals for people that don't have major issues, I think would be a big step forward in incentivizing others to be compliant and to not drag feet if they had in the past, but to know that they will be considered rapidly and
So I don't have a perfect response for you right now, Grant, but I hear the concern, and I think that in large part, the candidates that we've been putting effort into getting out on a more weekly basis are going to be a way that the department can be communicating messaging on that and using it in the future.
okay, and I'm sorry I bring this up, but it's rare to have an opportunity to discuss things in person. So thank you for indulging me.
All right. Anything else from the group before we wrap up this morning? Thank you. For your time.
And Nira?
That's all I wanted to say. I'm in another meeting while listening to this one, so I just wanted to thank everyone that spoke and for
Second that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.